Welcome back to our fifth lecture that covers the topics of individual characteristics and behavior. In this, the second part of the lecture, you will learn about cognitive abilities, what they are, how we assess them, and why they are important in life and work. We will also devote some attention to the question of emotional intelligence. Speaking of intelligence, what is intelligence? We define intelligence as a general mental capability that, among other things, involves the ability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. Intelligence is not book learning or academic skills or test-taking smarts. Rather, it reflects a broader and deeper capability for comprehending our surroundings. The capability of making sense of things and of figuring out what to do. How does intelligence relate to cognitive abilities? Here's the gist of the most comprehensive and empirically supported model of the structure of cognitive abilities. It has been created by three psychologists, Raymond Cattell, John Hord, and John Carroll, and therefore bears their names. According to this model, people have numerous primary mental abilities, such as, for example, the ability to estimate lengths of objects, or the ability to spell words, or the ability to recall items, or the ability to produce different ways of saying the same thing. These abilities can be measured or tested. We can group these primary abilities into broad categories, such as, for example, short-term memory, long-term memory storage and retrieval, visual processing, auditory processing, fluid reasoning, and so forth. And ultimately, there is a general mental ability that is a single factor that underlies all specific abilities. This general mental ability, or GMA for short, or just G, as it's otherwise often referred to, is what we would call in common parlance intelligence. General mental ability is latent. That means you cannot directly assess it. It is also an abstraction in the sense that there's nothing in reality, so no particular part of the brain or any of the brain's facets that directly corresponds to it. But we can get a glimpse of a person's GMA from their performance on various tests of mental ability. Think of this that way. We can ask 100 people to take a test that requires them to find the next number in a series of numbers. Some of them would do this better than others. Why? Well, because some of these people are generally better at all cognitive tests. Some are better at reasoning tasks as a whole, and some are better specifically at numerical reasoning tasks. Of course, there would also be an error and idiosyncratic variance. For example, some of them just felt better on the day. Altogether, researchers have identified 14 broad categories of mental abilities. Of these, 4 categories are related to knowledge. In particular, there is comprehension knowledge, also called crystallized intelligence. It reflects the breadth and depth of acquired knowledge of the language, information, and concepts of a specific culture. This is the kind of knowledge one gains during their formal and informal education and general life experiences. Then there is the domain-specific knowledge related to specific subject areas, such as, say, the ability to lip read, or mechanical knowledge, or knowledge of English as second language. Knowledge abilities also include reading and writing abilities, and they include the breadth and depth of quantitative or numerical knowledge. Another group of broad mental abilities are memory abilities. Short-term memory, remembering events that occurred in the last minute or so, and long-term memory storage and retrieval. Yet another group is the abilities related to controlled attention. These include abilities such as fluid reasoning, the ability to use deliberate mental operations to solve novel problems that can't be performed automatically. What mental operations? Well, for example, classifying, identifying relations, extrapolating. Then there's processing speed, the ability to automatically and fluently perform relatively easy and well-learned elementary cognitive tasks. And there's the reaction and decision speed. And the fourth and final group covers the abilities related to perception of various stimuli. The stimuli may be visual images and sensations, so you would have the ability to visualize things or to accurately perceive spatial relations. They can also be sound, and so you would have the ability to find patterns in sounds and musical structures. Then there are tactile abilities, which involve the judging of sensations received through touch, olfactory abilities that relate to smell, and kinesthetic abilities, which depend on sensory receptors that detect bodily position, weight, or movement. And as I mentioned earlier, each of these broad categories includes a range of primary mental abilities. Here's an example of primary mental abilities included within the category of long-term memory storage and retrieval. This is by no means an exhaustive list, but just a selection to give you a flavor. So within long-term storage and retrieval, there are primary mental abilities such as free recall memory. This refers to your ability to recall as many unrelated items as possible in any order after you have been shown a large collection of items. There's also naming fluency, the ability to rapidly name a concept or a thing when you're presented with a picture or description, and so forth. Now, specific cognitive abilities are relevant for specific jobs. For example, perceptual speed, the ability to quickly recognize similarities and differences in visual stimuli. Who would that be relevant for? Well, that would be relevant for a fashion designer in order to identify irregular patterns in fabric. Then you have a specific cognitive ability of number aptitude, the ability to work with numbers in a quick and accurate manner. Who this is important for? Well, it's important for, say, accountants who need to be able to quickly spot errors in a financial report. And, well, to give you another example, spatial visualization, the ability to imagine how various objects will look when rotated in space. Who would that be helpful for? Well, that would be helpful for architects. So, specific cognitive abilities are relevant for specific jobs. On the other hand, the overarching general mental ability, as a combination of various mental abilities, is essential for all life and work tasks. An extensive research evidence shows that general mental ability has a very significant impact on many important life and work outcomes. Why? This is because general mental ability helps people to navigate their environments. Individuals with high general mental ability are better at understanding what goes around them. They're better at predicting how other people would act and how they should act themselves in response. They're also better at understanding and calculating the risks. They're also more patient and better learners. It's not surprising, therefore, that general mental ability is strongly correlated with many important life outcomes, from health-related behaviors, such as smoking and exercising, to educational achievement and occupational success. For example, people who score higher on GMA tests tend to make healthier lifestyle in dietary choices. They tend to have better health. They tend to be less likely to have chronic illnesses, such as cardiovascular disease, and they tend to live longer. It's also not surprising that intelligence has a strong impact on work-related behaviors and outcomes. First and foremost, GMA impacts job performance, regardless of how you measure the performance, whether you use objective measures such as work samples or subjective indicators such as the rating of performance by supervisors. GMA also predicts performance in training programs. So this is not surprising. What is, however, remarkable is the extent of the impact. Literally thousands of studies of the relationship between GMA and job performance have been conducted over the last 100 years. They show overwhelmingly that GMA is by far the best predictor of job performance. In quantitative terms, the predictive validity of GMA for job performance, that's the correlation between GMA and job performance, is in the region of 0.65. This is a very high correlation. Now, where have we got this number? This value is the average of 8 meta-analytic estimates. That is not 8 studies, but 8 meta-analyses, meaning that each covered dozens, if not hundreds of studies. General mental ability also has a high predictive validity for the amount learned in job training programs, for jobs at all job levels that have been studied. And the average validity value across these 8 meta-analyses is 0.67. These results are of paramount importance for selection, and we will return to these results in the 4th section of this lecture. Effectively, when an employer uses GMA to select employees, employer can select the individuals who will have a high level of performance on the job and will also learn the most from job training programs. Incidentally, I've given the numbers here, 0.65, 0.67, these are the correlations. How high are these correlations? Remember, we talked about small, medium, large, or high correlations. Well, everything that's above 0.5 is large, and the correlations, like the ones here for GMA, are actually very high, not just by social science standards, but by any standards. For comparison, I've given one example of this correlation previously. The association between ibuprofen, which is anti-inflammatory medicine, and pain reduction is in the region of 0.14, 0.14 that is. That's much smaller. Now, I'll give a couple of more examples. Correlation between Viagra and improved sexual functioning is 0.38. Again, much less than GMA and job performance. And the correlation between nearness to the equator and daily temperature is 0.6. Again, less than the correlation between GMA and job performance. And, nearness to the equator and daily temperatures is something you would imagine are highly correlated. Of course, the impact of GMA on job performance does vary by occupation. It's particularly high for high complexity jobs, such as professional, scientific, and upper management jobs. However, it is also substantial for the lowest complexity jobs. And as it turns out, being able to learn better and faster, or to solve the problems quicker and with greater ingenuity, serves you well in terms of your performance, regardless of whether you're a brain surgeon or a manual worker. Here are the data from meta-analysis covering the studies of various occupations in Europe. You can see that the validity does vary, but it's pretty high for all jobs. My apologies that this slide doesn't seem to have worked particularly well, so I will recite what's here. Skilled workers, the validity here is 0.55, sales workers 0.66, police 0.24, manager 0.67, engineer 0.63, information clerk 0.61, and so forth. So yes, the validity varies, but pretty high. Now, police seems to be an exception, but the problem here is with the data, not with the logic of influence. The performance data for police usually come from supervisor ratings, and supervisors in police force usually do not observe their supervisors in the field, so they may not provide a sufficiently accurate assessment of performance. Our next question is, okay, well, we've established that GMA matters, but how do we measure general mental ability? Well, we use tests, and one of the most widely used tests is the Wechsler's Adult Intelligence Scale, which was originally created in the 1950s and is now in its 5th edition. It's often called an IQ test, but actually the term IQ is somewhat outmoded. The old IQ test would calculate your ratio score by dividing your mental age by your chronological age and multiplying the result by 100. Today's IQ tests, including this test, produce something called deviation IQ scores rather than ratio IQ scores. This means that they chart each person's performance on a bell curve against the standard distribution of all other test takers. So your deviation IQ scores are your scores against all other people who have taken the test. Also, you need to know that intelligence tests, and Wechsler's test is no exception, they measure intelligence not as a general capacity, not how good you are potentially, but as performance. That is to say, how well you can perform on specific mental tasks. So, what does a mental abilities test look like? The Wechsler test consists of 4 sections: verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. And each test includes subtests. For example, verbal comprehension test includes a similarity subtest, where you would be asked to explain, for example, in what respect some common objects or concepts are similar. Well, to give an example, how are whales and lions similar? How are anger and delight similar? How are boys and girls similar? And verbal comprehension test also includes a vocabulary subtest. For example, you may be presented with a picture and asked to name the object depicted, or you may be given a word and asked to explain what it means. So this is a part of the test that depends on language and knowledge. Other parts, however, largely do not depend on these. And for example, perceptual reasoning is measured using visual puzzles, like this one, where you have to figure out which 3 of the 6 pieces presented would go together to make the puzzle at the top. Or you can be given what's called a figure weights test, and you need to choose from 5 sets of objects which would balance the scale on the right. Okay, so to sum up, general mental ability is a latent factor that underlies specific mental abilities. An individual GMA can be assessed through their performance on general mental ability tests. General mental ability or intelligence are important for life and for work. And intelligence matters for all jobs. GMA or intelligence is also by far the best predictor of task performance and performance in training. Right. Well, this is about your standard, normal intelligence, general mental ability. Now, what about emotional intelligence? Well, this is a concept that has received a lot of popular attention. much more than the actual intelligence, and much more that, in my opinion, it deserves. Why do I say that? Because research evidence on emotional intelligence is nowhere near as abundant, clear, and conclusive as that for general mental ability. So let me briefly tell you what emotional intelligence is not, explain what it is, and give a gist of what we know about the role of emotional intelligence. Firstly, what emotional intelligence is not. It's certainly not about thinking with your right brain, even if we accept that the left brain is more analytical and the right is more arty and creative. Emotional intelligence is also not about thinking with your heart, which is a weird concept anyhow, and it's not about being all warm and fuzzy and cuddly and, well, emotional. And finally, contrary to what Daniel Goleman, who is the author of the bestseller that launched emotional intelligence into the popular psychology, and other authors who follow him say, so contrary to what they say, emotional intelligence does not and cannot possibly matter than general mental ability. What emotional intelligence is, it's the ability to accurately reason about emotions. It's also the ability to use emotions and emotional knowledge to enhance your thinking. So this is the scholarly approach to emotional intelligence. If we take this approach to emotional intelligence, then there may be a good reason to identify mental abilities that are associated with perceiving, analyzing, and utilizing emotions. Well, we have just seen that there are particular mental abilities that relate to learning and reasoning about a particular type of material. For example, verbal or comprehension intelligence describes the capacity to learn words and to reason about words. Perceptual intelligence concerns the ability to reason about visual patterns. So in a similar fashion, emotional intelligence would signal an ability to recognize emotions, an ability to understand the meanings of emotion words. In a more systematic way, according to a model introduced by Mayer and Salovey in 1997, which is the most trustworthy model of emotional intelligence in circulation at this stage, emotional intelligence includes four things. Firstly, it includes perception, the ability to recognize emotions in yourself and in other people by observing them. Observing their faces, posture, tone of voice. Secondly, emotional intelligence includes the understanding of emotions. Understanding how different emotions can combine together and how emotions can change. For example, how sadness can subside or how anger can build up. Emotional intelligence also includes emotion management, being able to regulate your own emotions and help others do the same. The fourth aspect of emotional intelligence is facilitation. This, I must confess, is the least explored facet of emotional intelligence and probably the most puzzling. Facilitation means using emotions to do things better. For example, apparently, if you're sad, you are better at performing tasks that require attention to detail. So, how emotionally intelligent are you? For example, can you tell what a person is feeling just by looking at their face? Generally, psychologists find that most people can fairly easily detect 6 basic emotions: happy, sad, fearful, angry, surprised, and disgusted. For example, people usually express their happiness by drawing up their cheeks and stretching the mouth in a smile. Surprise is also easily detected. A surprised expression includes wide open eyes and dropped open mouth. However, more complex emotions may be more difficult to detect. American researchers have recently managed to analyze and computer generate the models for facial expressions for 21 different emotions, including emotions such as happily surprised, which is actually a compound of the expressions for happy and surprised. They even identified the expressions for such seemingly contradictory emotions such as happily disgusted. Apparently, happily disgusted is an expression that combines the scrunched up eyes and nose of disgusted with the smile of happy. They say that this is how you feel when you watch one of those funny movies and something happens that's really disgusting, but you just have to laugh because it's so incredibly funny. Right. Well, there are actually specific tests that have been developed to test emotional intelligence. One of the most developed and broadly used is Myers-Salivey-Crusoe Emotional Intelligence Test, or MSCEIT. This test corresponds to the four-branch model of emotional intelligence that we have just seen. The test measures how people perform on emotion-related tasks and solve emotional problems. The tests include questions such as the one that you can see on this slide. Imagine that you need to figure out what caused the fight between three children. Each of the children is telling a different story, and so naturally figuring out what happened requires you to attend to the details of the stories and to weigh many facts. Now the question is, what mood or moods might be helpful to feel when figuring out what caused the fight? Is it happiness, surprise, or sadness? I will let you ponder this for a moment. Here's another example. Which of the following combinations of emotions most closely reflect a feeling of concern? Again, I'll let you ponder this for a few seconds. This item tests your ability to understand complex emotions. And here's one more example from the test. This item asks you to identify an underlying emotion based on a set of various feelings and sensations. So imagine if you're feeling loud, large, delicate, and bright green. How much is that feeling like? Feeling excited, or jealous, or afraid? So these are just the examples of the items from the emotional intelligence test. As I said earlier, research on emotional intelligence is still in its, well, if not infancy, then toddlerhood. And research evidence is quite limited, but the initial findings do suggest that high emotional intelligence is important and may be correlated with better social relations and less social deviance among children, because that's only been studied in children. In adults, high emotional intelligence leads to greater self-perception of social competence. High emotional intelligence individuals are perceived by others as more pleasant to be around and more compassionate. Emotional intelligence also seems to be correlated with some aspects of family and intimate relationships, and closer to the work life and laboratory experiments, emotional intelligence seems to improve negotiation outcomes. Finally, high emotional intelligence is correlated with greater life satisfaction and self-esteem and lower ratings of depression. Now, once emotional intelligence has gained ground, not just in popular imagination, but also in scientific research, it has spurred the emergence of extension concepts. For instance, psychologists are now suggesting that there may be such thing as personal intelligence and even social intelligence. So personal intelligence would be about identifying information about one's personality, understanding one's own and other personalities, and using this knowledge to make various decisions. And the social intelligence, it's about using social information about groups rather than individuals, group status, membership, group dynamics. And, well, why not? If you can distinguish a separate ability to identify information about emotions, then you may also separate an ability to identify information about personality or about how people interact in groups. Of course, this may be taking the concept of intelligence a bit too far, but let's not judge prematurely. The future might tell. So as I have just mentioned the term personality, it's time for us to move on to discussion of personality, which is the topic of the third part of this lecture. What is personality? And why and how does it matter in organizations? Well, please move on to the next recording when you're ready to learn about personality.